All right, well, we'll get started. I'm Mike Druckman. I'm a partner in the global law firm Hogan, Lovells, and I'm very honored to moderate today's session, Global Strategies Finding Common Ground. Rather than reciting the long list of accomplishments of our distinguished speakers and having them present PowerPoints that everyone could just read, we're going to be a little bit more dynamic today. And we're going to have a presentation, which is mostly discussion, that I encourage all of you to participate in. That will be only for the benefit of those who are wise enough to come to today's session. So thank you for coming. I'm just going to give a few words on how awesome our panelists are, and then we'll jump right into it. And our panelists are going to share their secrets for developing disease-curing medicines, for making millions of dollars, and for changing the world. So turn off your cell phones, turn off your iPads, take out your pens and paper, start taking notes. And not just because these gentlemen can change your lives, but because I'm going to quiz you, and there'll be an exam at the end. All right. So, a few words on our speakers. Dr. Avi Treves, our gentleman in the middle, is currently Deputy Director of the Cancer Research Center at the Sheba Medical Center in Israel. Among his many responsibilities is to operate the Stem Cell Translational Laboratory at the Sheba Center for Regenerative Medicine. He's served as a consulting and scientific advisory board member for over 14 different biopharmaceutical companies, and he's co-authored more than 90 scientific publications and 10 patents. Today, Dr. Treves will share some of his secrets for forming successful and profitable strategic partnerships between startup companies like Gamida Cell Limited, which he founded in 1998, and global pharmaceutical companies like Novartis. So he really knows what he's doing in this area. So he's got some good insights to share. Dr. Chris Mason is currently Professor of Regenerative Medicine, Bioprocessing, and the Advanced Center for Biochemical Engineering at University College in London. His focus on the clinical translation and commercialization of cell and gene therapies and tissue engineered products has given him a unique ability to bridge academia and industry. Last year, the World Stem Cells Regenerative Medicine Congress recognized him as the third most influential person in the stem cell field in the whole world. So among Dr. Mason's many publications, and those of you that were in sessions yesterday know this, is an article entitled Cell Therapy Industry, Billion-Dollar Global Business with Unlimited Potential. Today, Dr. Mason will share some of his secrets for unlocking that potential. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Michael May. He is currently the CEO of the Center for Commercialization for Regenerative Medicine, CCRM, which is a Canadian, federally incorporated, not-for-profit organization whose mission is to bridge the valley of death, which we've all heard a lot about, between discovery and commercialization. CCRM's goal is to bring $500 million in new funding and risk capital to stem cell development over 10 years. So far, CCRM has built an industry consortium of more than 35 leading global regenerative medicine companies. It has its own GMP facility, and it has a cadre of scientific experts committed to performing research that academia and others are not doing. Today, Dr. May will share his insights into leveraging federal funding to attract private investment and to speed your path to commercialization. So we're going to just get right into it with the questions. I'm going to start, but I encourage each of you to jump in. There's a microphone in the middle, but feel free to just stand at your place and shout out questions when the spirit moves you. So we're going to start with Dr. Treves. Dr. Treves, my first question to you, you've got experience with strategic global partnerships. So the question is, for a startup company, seeking, when is the right time for seeking a strategic partnership with a large global pharmaceutical company, and what are the considerations that should go into that issue?
There is not a simple answer for that. If you go by the book, you should wait at least after phase 1. So you build value, and then you need not only the money of the big pharma, but also the experience of conducting clinical trials. But from my experience, when you are a startup company, you look for partners and for funding whenever they are, wherever they are. And you cannot be so choosy. And usually you get, if you can, strategic partner, even if it is in a very early stage. However, there is one point that I'd like to mention. Whichever kind of fundraising you are doing, set a milestone that will increase the value of the company in a way that you will be able to do your next round with much higher valuation and raise enough money to get this milestone, not less. Otherwise, you will be in big trouble in the second phase.
Thank you, Dr. Treves. So let me now move to Dr. Mason. Dr. Treves mentioned the real importance of deciding about how you seek funding. So Dr. Mason, I'd like to get your perspective on the role of academia and whether startup companies, what role they should consider for partnering with academic institutions, and what role academic institutions should be playing in that strategy, and whether there are issues for partnering early with an academic institution that could affect your funding and strategy later on.
Yeah, Mike, thanks. I mean, I think that's a very good question. I mean, traditionally we've seen in drug discovery, a discovery made in the laboratory, you can draw out a nice simple molecule and then literally throw it over the wall to the chemists who can then make it. And that's really what Big Pharma has done, and done it extremely well for decades, basically. Take a molecule you can describe perfectly. Our challenge with cell therapy is very different. We can't easily characterize these cells very well, and we often have processes, especially early on when it's in the research stage, which are nowhere near robust. And so we have a much longer development path while still really in academia. And I think that the model which we're now moving more and more towards, and I'm sure Michael will speak about this as well, is that you need to develop it as long as possible in the academic setting, not forming a company early at all. I mean, avoiding that, using basically grants and other funding to advance the idea as far as you can possibly get it. But then also working with these translation centres, things like the CCRM in Canada or the Cell Therapy Catapult in the UK. There are similar organisations in many other countries. And really then developing, again, before you've actually gone into the company mode, getting as far as possible using non-dilutional money, and then only then you're ready to go and move into the world of commerce and looking to raise money. And I would totally agree with your comments, Avi, about, raise the money you need to raise to get to the next inflection point. If you don't do that, you're in serious trouble. But it'd be interesting to have Michael's comments, because I think I fit the academic part and then very much hand over to great translation centres like Michael's. Michael, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I would say that what you're saying is true. There's a lot of infrastructure in academic institutions, a lot of unused capabilities. So building translation centers and support for advancing technologies in collaboration with academic institutions, I think, is very valuable. But I think we also have to recognize that there are special skills required to commercialize, and that I think we put too much, we demand too much of our academics to commercialize, and the tech transfer offices in universities to do that. So CCRM is an example of a model where, in partnership with the academics and the academic institutions, we've created a translation center with a different skill set and with dedicated facilities to advance technologies for either out-licensing to companies or eventually for company creation. I think that's a model that is evolving, and it's a model that can work well in a capital-limited environment, and one where very special skills are required to commercialize effectively and efficiently.
But that's also something you do very well, is that, I mean, if I'm an academic and I bring a great idea to you, or I think it's a great idea, you would do the due diligence to say, well, Chris, I don't know. This is a nice bit of science, but it's not a company. And I think that's something that a very valuable thing that the CCRM and other translations centres provide, is that they give that sanity check. We as scientists think, wow, this is really exciting. And you say, well, what can it really do? Well, it can cure about 3 patients a year. Well, that's great for those patients, but that's not a business, and that should be developed by another route.
But, you know,
I think,
part of that, though, is having, by having individuals in the translation center that understand the science.
Absolutely.
That type of, the discussion with the researcher can happen in an environment of mutual respect.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's okay to say it's not ready for commercialization, or if commercialization is the pathway, these are the milestones you need to achieve, and we are going to help you get there. Or, you know, there are already 10,000 patents out there that describe exactly your invention. This is not going to work, but being able to have those conversations early on in an environment of partnership. You know, you talk about partnerships, nothing can be done on your own.
Yes,
I mean,
correct.
From the earliest stages to the strategic partnership with a pharma company, there are partnerships strategic along the way in different forms.
So let me ask Dr. Treves, since you have gone the route primarily of going right to partnerships with large pharma, although you can tell me the different options, your views on the value of these sort of collaborations early with organizations such as Dr. May, and what are the pros and cons of taking that approach, and the challenges you've seen to that approach versus sort of going it more on your own and trying to figure it out?
You can never do it on your own. I mean, even if you have a good translational research group in your own institute, or you collaborate with one, in a very early stage, you will have to bring to the group, to the partnership, expertise from the business, from commercialization. They think differently in many aspects. And if you really want to develop some molecule or cell therapy or new technology into the market, you need them very early. They will be compatible to what you want to do, but they will have always different aspects that they will introduce into the game. And one more point that I'd like to mention, which I think is very important. When you develop something, or your group develops something which is tended to be a new cure, a new treatment, bring the relevant physician, doctor, into the group as early as possible. Because many scientists will develop molecules and cell therapies to clinical applications which are not in need. And there should be a clinical need, and only the specialist, the expert doctor, whether it's an oncologist or a rheumatologist, can tell you there is a need here, and this is the direction that you have to go to solve this need, and not just to develop a cure for something that there are already many other alternatives in the market.
Great.
Yeah, I was just gonna support that comment. I've observed in many of the translation centers, and even in ours in the early days, the lack of integration of the basic scientists with the clinicians around a commercial plan. And you know, clinicians are busy, but it's really important to get that clinical input into a product concept, because in fact the clinicians are the first customer for these products, and they understand how that needs to be delivered, and what the endpoints are the best. And I still see a lack of connection and integration between the kind of clinical inputs at the early stage and the basic sciences, and the commercial side as well.
Is that one of the factors that CCRM actually identifies as one of the criteria for selecting companies that you'll work with?
So we create companies, and we try to build that in early on. Although when we started, we also didn't engage the clinicians well enough. But when we certainly, it's one of the many parameters in doing diligence on an early stage company that is looking for support from us or investment from us. It's really about validating the product concept. But it's one, cost, alignment with our capabilities, the market size. There's a whole host of things to look at. But clinical validation is very, very important. Clinician validation.
Yeah, I think that's true, and it's very hard. I mean, it'd be interesting to do the numbers on this meeting. I bet there's very few clinicians here, and I think that is a common thread. I think that the clinicians, as yet, we haven't managed to fully engage them. And the projects I've worked on, if they don't have a clinician champion, invariably don't go forward, because the amount of effort needed to actually get something into the clinic and even into a proof of concept or a phase 1 study is a huge task for any clinician. Unless they're really right behind it and really believe in it, they're not going to do it. And so I would agree with Michael, we need to get that engagement.
Well, actually, let's ask that question. For those of you who joined, this is going to be an interactive session. And so we're going to interact, but I want you all to interact. So the first question is, are there any clinicians with us? We just talked about we have one. Only one?
Well done.
Any other clinicians here? All right, we have a few. All right. Now, how about people that are developing, that are in startup companies? Any startup companies here? All right, we have one. How about other folks that are in the developing stage of a medicine? Okay. So how many of you who are in development stage have you brought in clinicians at this stage? Yes. And did you start that at a very early stage? What stage?
Very good.
From the beginning. And others experiences with bringing in clinicians? Still a consideration? So go out. Don't wait. Now's the time. All right, now I said I was going to quiz you. You thought I was kidding about that. I really wasn't. The lady just, not the first row, the second row, I'm calling on you. All of you be ready. I'm going to call on people. If you'd stand up, please. This is a Socratic method for those of you who've been in law school. So please announce who you are.
Marie Vodka.
All right. Dr. Vodka, I believe. So I said there'd be a quiz. So how many scientific publications has Dr. Treves co-authored?
What a crazy question.
I have from my notes at least 9 pages.
Excellent.
Whoa,
2 points for you. See,
through.
she's taking notes. I told you there'd be a quiz. Okay, thank you. Now we can resume, but if anyone has questions, I encourage you. A question. We have a question already.
Okay, so I think that's a very, very good question because it opens up a number of avenues. So first of all, I think the most important one is there that sometimes you may have a potential therapy for a very small group of patients, and that's not commercializable. But there are other great avenues for taking that down a route where patients can benefit. So at University College London, for example, we've been tissue engineering airways. The total number of patients who are likely to benefit or need an airway rather per year is probably a couple of hundred. It's not a business, or at least we don't perceive it as a business. And so we do that through our own hospital GMP units, and we treat the patients that way. We're never going to commercialize it, but it's going to be very available to patients. We'll do clinical trials, we'll do the safety data, we'll do everything that's necessary, but we're not going to take it down the commercial path. So that's the first part on that. So just because something's small in terms of medical indication, it may be very important to patients, and we certainly want to develop it, and we certainly want to make it routine clinical practice, and we're doing that for a number of indications. Then the next thing, which I think is absolutely critical here, is what you don't want is a therapy to fail for the wrong reasons, and I think that's why we're seeing cell therapies are coming adrift at the moment. It's very rare to see a cell therapy fail on safety. It tends to be that they either run out of money during the development process, the regulatory process isn't well enough understood and it takes too long to get through it, reimbursement is inadequate or can't be done quick enough, the manufacturing isn't there. So I think what we do with the academic setting and the translation settings is that we try and de-risk all those areas so we don't see cell therapies which could do a great job for patients failing unnecessarily, and I think that's one of the biggest things we have to avoid, and that's what I've seen most of the failures actually are really unnecessary failures rather than failing because they just didn't work.
Dr. May, do you have any thoughts about how to avoid those kind of early failures?
Avoiding the early failures. I think a lot of that can be around the proper kind of analysis early on, and also I think we need to do a better job at designing the right kind of studies and trials. And for example, one of the things that we do is with a partner, we help new companies or or researchers design their clinical trials so that the endpoints will achieve both the endpoints for reimbursement and also regulatory approval. And we match them up with already a set of clinicians among academic or institutional partnerships. So they get the clinicians involved, the right clinicians, and they design the clinical trials for both of those purposes, because a lot of times we fail by designing a trial for regulatory approval, but then we haven't evaluated on a cost-benefit perspective for reimbursement. And in fact, we find that reimbursement is often the last thing that people consider after many, many years, and reimbursement will always be related to cost-benefit, and that cost-benefit changes with the standard of care. So if you're on a 10-year development cycle, and every year over that 10 years, the standard of care is improving, about the 8th year, the headroom for improvement from your therapy could now be insignificant, and there's no way anyone will ever justify paying for it. So this analysis has to happen early, and it has to happen on an ongoing basis, and we need to design those trials up front. I'm going to not disagree with Chris, but I'm going to change what he said a little bit. Some of these therapies that may be in niche markets or for small numbers of patients, I think that there still can be justified on a commercial basis.
Yes, I don't disagree
it's
on that.
Just
there are examples.
The commercial they may not be commercializable by a large company or a company, but there's still commercial models integrating healthcare systems and healthcare institutions into the commercial model. And so I think there are, if it's justified from a cost-benefit perspective, and in many cases these orphan indications are.
Yeah, these are sub-orphans, but you're right.
Then they're commercially relevant.
I was going to raise that very question because in the United States there's the Orphan Drug Act. And there are a number of companies that we deal with who their model is focusing on the orphan drug population and even micro-orphan populations. Because of the legislative incentives that have been put in place, companies have found ways to make it very commercial. And there are some additional strategies that people haven't even considered very much. For example, in the United States, there's something called a pediatric orphan population voucher, which allows a company that gets an orphan orphan indication, which means a very small patient population, in a pediatric population, so only for children, to receive a voucher, which is essentially a right to get priority review in the United States, and that's extremely valuable. And it was, and it can be sold. So the company doesn't have to have its own products. It can then sell it to another company, a large company that's willing to pay millions of dollars. And the one that's been issued actually did receive millions of dollars for their voucher.
I think the challenge is that, and I sort of agree and don't. I think for small molecules and biologics, you're absolutely correct. I think the problem for us is that the cost of goods is so very high that's what makes them non-commercial. So, for example, for our airway, we've just put a paper together. It's about $250,000 per airway to make. That's just the basic costs of all the service and everything else. Now, could you ever justify getting that reimbursed? Well, probably very unlikely, but does it serve patients well? Yes, it does. So I think that's a therapy that stays within the hospital setting, in the specialist centres. But I do agree with Michael, if the indication is big enough and you can get a big enough margin, the margin is there, so it's something like a cell, where maybe the cost of production is in the thousands rather than in the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. It's a different proposition.
Dr. Treves.
I just want to add, one of the costs in developing a new treatment is mostly at the end during the phase 3 clinical trials. There is a way in the United States to get reimbursement from the patient or from the insurance company for the direct cost of the study. So usually you are not allowed to charge any money for a clinical trial from a patient. But in certain cases, and especially for orphan drugs, but in several other cases of very diseases which have no other treatments, they will allow you to charge money which cover the direct cost, which usually is almost everything, and get your budget very low in this phase 3 clinical study?
Yeah, well, that's an excellent question. And I personally have actually worked with companies. It's called cost recovery in the United States, and it does allow, it's an exception that allows companies to recover their cost. So where they might otherwise not have the money, that might be a way. So it's additional supplemental. It's not usually, in my experience, enough, but it can make the difference, enough by itself. So it's not something you could really base a whole model on, but it could be just the difference that can help you go forward.
Actually, be interesting to ask Chris, who's become a bit of an expert on the evolving regulatory approval and reimbursement policy in Japan, to talk about how, what is evolving there in allowing companies to get reimbursement, but also to, to get products on the market.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I mean, the Japanese are revolutionizing this space. So about a year ago, they passed 2 new laws which enabled companies to do an initial study in patients, which is not called a phase 1 or 2. They're going to call it basically a safety study that should show some degree of efficacy, ideally. And if at the end of that study you've shown safety and a degree of efficacy or suggested efficacy, then you could apply for something called a conditional approval. And that conditional approval then allows you to market your product in Japan with reimbursement, and that's critical for companies. That's the big win. It's not just early regulatory approval, but it's also reimbursement that's written into the law as well, for a 7-year period, and at the end of the 7 years you then have to apply for a full approval for your product. And so that's a real game changer. And why have they allowed that? Well, basically because they've seen that cell therapies have a very strong safety record globally. I mean, there are only a very, very few studies where cells have had an issue with safety. The only ones I can think of have been T-cell ones where they've locked on to other cells in the body apart from the target, and I think that's about 2 or 3 different studies that have shown that. But so tiny out of all the thousands of clinical trials. So they knew that cell therapy had a good safety profile, and they also knew that a lot of patients could benefit from these therapies, and what they wanted to do was make sure that patients received high quality treatment in Japan rather than going maybe elsewhere and receiving therapies that, well, maybe weren't quite as well characterized and well known. So it was really a pragmatic approach, and its aim is, to generate health and wealth.
Yeah, so let me take you through a scenario though. I'm a new Canadian company and I want to do a clinical trial. And Canada has conditional approval too, actually.
But no reimbursement,
no reimbursement.
That's the problem.
So I'm a Canadian company and I want to get efficacy data. So I go to Japan and I do my trial there.
The Chris-Basin hybrid we're talking about.
I do my trial in Japan. I get the Japanese taxpayers to get all my phase 2, 3, what's not really called that, but efficacy data, and then I take that data on the back of the Japanese taxpayer and go to the FDA and Health Canada and Europe, and I get approval elsewhere. What is that? Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes. So what I've proposed.
No. Why do you call it Japanese taxpayers? They pay for a drug, which can help them.
No, it's 70% reimbursed by the government is the way it's going to work, and the 30% is the patient. So what I've proposed is that the world is not a level playing field, and I proposed this to FDA and to MHRA in the UK. And we're actually having a conference in Japan to discuss this approach. And the approach is that why not take the best bits of both systems? So Mike was absolutely right. The suggestion is that you do your manufacturing in the US or Canada. You do your study in US or Canada to generate initial safety data, but you need a dialogue with the Japanese when you do it, because you mustn't do just a normal safety study. It'll be too small. The Japanese will not accept it. So you need to do a study which will satisfy both the North American regulators and the Japanese regulators, so that you could then use that data to apply for your conditional approval in Japan. Now, the law isn't, we haven't seen the final text. You may have to do a very, very small bridging study of say 10, 12 patients, something small, or you may not. We don't know that bit. But anyway, you do your majority of that initial study in North America. You get your conditional approval, and as Mike quite rightly said, you're then getting reimbursement for your product in Japan, which you're happening to make in North America. So then you're making money. You come back to the US with 2 years worth of that data, because what they're going to do in Japan is when it's out on conditional approval, they're going to keep a record, a register of all those patients that you've treated, and use that registry data as really supplementary data to a pivotal filing. You then do your pivotal trial in the US or Europe. You take that data back to Japan, because their challenge is, all they've got is the register. Now, the register doesn't help them know whether this is a great therapy or not. They can monitor safety, sure, but they don't know if it's better than the gold standard. So then you go back to Japan with your data you've generated in North America from your pivotal study. You get approval in both the US and Japan. But the really key bit is the reimbursement. You've got reimbursement from the end, after about 2 years is where you get it for your initial product in Japan with the conditional approval. You've had reimbursement way through, but you've not just had reimbursement, you've had ability to get health technology assessment data all that time, which you can then use back in the US or Canada to justify how you're going to get reimbursement in the US, so you accelerate that bit of the pathway as well. So you've got regulation and reimbursement very early, and I really urge people to look at Japan very hard. They are very keen to reach out to companies in the rest of the world with products, because what they don't want is this brand new act to come out and then nobody does it. So there are companies like Mesoblast, Athersys, Satori, and a number of others already looking at it. And I think it's true to say that the people who helped them early in Japan get things moving, will be part of the process of how it's put together.
Well,
I think
we have a question for the audience, so let me just, ma'am, why don't you go ahead? If you could go to the microphone, please.
Well, thank you so much for this very exciting, inspiring discussion. First of all, I'd like to disclaim where I am Xiaohong Fan. By training is oncologist. By working, I'm medical officer at FDA, United States.
Great.
So this is really right timing. I'm so glad that we have this open dialogue regarding the works and regulatory aspects of this fascinating stem cell research and therapies front. So with that, and I would like to say that usually in the FDA, I don't know, maybe other regulatory authorities as well, when we express our opinion, we need to go through internal discussion if you have any interaction with the FDA before we say anything. But like now, so I want to say, I represent myself, so my opinion hasn't been discussed. With that, I want to say a few things.
We won't hold you to it. Or we won't hold FDA to it.
All right, thank you. First of all, I want to say is that why I'm here. I work for the Center of Biologic Evaluation and Research. So you have a small molecules center as a CEDR, and you have a Center of Biologics, and that is SABR. And I used to work at CEDR, but later I work at SABR. I have myself background as geneticist. But anyway, so the stem cell, the research, we are dealing with getting more and more applications. We have seen that the increased number of investigators conduct trials and come up with different applications to the early stage and gradually move on to the late stage. So it's a new field for us too. So we are also interested in what you are thinking, what you like to know about, for example, FDA, anything we can do to make it better. Because the mission of FDA, no matter CEDR, SABR, or we have the device, our mission is want to facilitate the development, advancement of the effective and the safe drug, biologics for the patient, for public. So with that, that's my goal. My field trip right now is to want to also collect the input from you, or your voice, what you think we can do from FDA standpoint. From that, my next one, I want to address a few comments you touched upon regarding the regulatory issues regarding the stem cell research. First of all, I want to say it's very exciting. It's the global strategy one. Actually, I've been debating on where I should go. There's concurrent, a couple of sessions, very interesting, directly related to what I'm doing. I'm a medical officer, so I'm doing more of the drug, mostly clinical aspects for clinical trial design, endpoints analysis, and of course, the most fascinating one is when the drug or biologic come to the late development, you are ready to file, you said that this is so exciting, we need to approve, we need to put in the market. So that's one part of my job is to evaluate the data, whether that is show the convention, depends, individualize the evidence of to be marketed. So with that, I want to tell you this, we have a lot of discussions with the major regulatory authorities, including EMA and Canada, Health Canada, and Australia, and also Japan. We used to have bilateral. We used to have a periodic discussion with the EMA. So some chemical. Some of the similar applications we discussed. Oh, what do you think? What you have had? So we would like to harmonize our thinking as well, because in a way, I think that usually the policies, politics, other than have regional difference. Overall, as human being, we're probably much more similar. So we did a lot of periodically have discussion with the EMA, and gradually we evolved to have discussion with the trilateral, including Japan, and quadrilateral, including Canada. Now we have quintilateral, we have Australia. I think gradually we are really increasing more and more. So this global regulatory regulation and policy of thinking pretty much harmonized. I want to let you know about that.
It's with respect to harmonization, I'm not sure true harmonization will ever happen because all these authorities are just so different. But for example, I mentioned Canada has a conditional approval policy, and they've actually just issued for outside review a new guidance document on clinical trials for cell therapy. So in Canada, the approach is to look at things on a case-by-case basis from a risk-benefit perspective. Now, Japan is doing the end piece, maybe aside from the reimbursement, is the same, but they're creating a very, very detailed new policy around this. The end might end up being the same, but there's a very different approach to doing that. And I think the U.S. is that it's still evolving in the U.S. The general approach towards cell therapies.
You're absolutely right. If I address, you're absolutely right. We recognize the disparities of medical practice in different countries. And regarding, for example, of course, each regulatory agency has their tradition, culture, how to evaluate what we're looking for. But overall, we look at the bigger picture. The bigger picture, at least we try to collaborate with each other and see that what we have there. One point I remember, and one of you mentioned about that, some of the clinical trial you conducted, it's very often right now, actually, we got early data collected in, for example, Mexico and Asia, China, and India, or even Israel and so many other countries for the early phase 1. Then they came to U.S. for the third, phase 3 studies or later one. Why is that? Or sometimes they have some data already, phase 3 in Europe, and then when they come, they would like to come to the U.S. to get this marketing approval. Usually we would like to, we evaluate. We evaluate, pay lots of attention to the data generated outside of U.S. But in the meantime, in order for those evidence decision of the regular decision apply to U.S. medical field, we need that fair amount, or we need adequate data information applicable to U.S. medical practice. So you have to recognize that difference. So there are some nuances there. But overall, very often we individualize as well. And one point.
So actually, let's give the speakers a chance to respond. And I'd like to raise that question, and particularly ask the speakers if you have any experience in that very question, which is companies that are interested in collecting data, as we talked about outside the United States, how difficult is it to get the United States to FDA to actually rely on it? And are there steps that you can take to make it easier? So I've actually looked at the numbers, and there are actually even though there's a regulation that says that FDA can approve a drug solely on foreign data, there are very few. I think the last time I looked, there were only 2 examples where that's actually ever happened. So my question, let me start with the speakers, is what strategies have you considered to make that more of a possibility? Or what questions do you have that companies should ask early on?
I think you want to do these studies as broadly as possible on a multinational basis and try and get approval everywhere. So I agree on that. And I also think the regulators are doing a much better job of reaching out to each other and actually having at least informal discussions to try and do that. And I know the FDA is deeply involved with that on the cell therapy side, and I'm very grateful for that. So I think there is convergence. It's slow, but it is coming. Now, I think the areas I see as the most challenging are certainly manufacturing. The manufacturing requirements between Europe and US are still very different, especially in expensive items like air handling units and what you need as background levels. And that does create major problems. It means you need a manufacturing facility for Europe and a manufacturing facility for US. That seems like madness to me. And I think that does need some rationalization on that side. But I think overall the regulators are beginning to work closer together, and I think that we have to work with the regulators and try and get that dialogue such that when a clinical trial happens, we work with the FDA and the MHRA, it starts to bring that knowledge. And I know Athosys, for example, has been doing a trial in the US and in the UK, very much trying to get that relationship. But it's a relationship you have to work on, and you have to go and talk to the regulators really early and bring them on. So actually I welcome the changes. They are a bit slow, but they are going in the right direction.
I'd like to, Dr. Treves, I know you've got quite a bit of experience in production and production challenges, particularly in different jurisdictions. So I'd ask you to share a few insights there and any issues that you've confronted about what companies should consider when considering production, as Dr. Mason just raised, that challenge of producing it in different countries.
Well, before going into production, you have to decide what's the business model of your operation. And in cell therapy, there are major 2 alternatives. Either it's an autologous therapy, so it's service model. It's not actually a product, but it's a processing of a product. And the other model is if you do allogeneic treatment, you can eventually, especially with mesenchymal stem cells, go into batch production and the pharma model, which from the production view, the second one, of course, is easier, although it has many difficulties by itself, but it's easier. You can have a central facility for production, and we have such in Israel, which are now producing in one facility in Israel and sending it in a frozen composition all over the world to multi-center clinical studies. Pluristem, for example, a company in Israel, which is producing mesenchymal stem cells for treatment of wound healing. But but most of the other companies are less lucky, and they are developing autologous treatments. And for autologous treatment, you need the manufacturer to be near the hospital. So you have to translate the production facility to the centers in which it's going to take place, the clinical study. So it's a big challenge, and it's very costly, and actually it's more like the trend of personalized medicine, which is going on even in the drug industry, but in the cell therapy, it's only this possibility. So you have to design your product in a way that it will reach the doctor in the final preparation that he will just take it, inject it. So ideally, it will be inside the syringe. So he will don't even have to pull it out of the tube because it's an open system. So if it's inside the syringe, it's ideal, but you cannot freeze it. So there are many challenges, and each product are trying to solve them.
I want to ask you a question, and this is actually something that some colleagues and I have talked about. That autologous problem that you raised with the proximity, one solution that one of my colleagues came up with is to have mobile units, mobile production units, that might be able to take the autologous product, process it on site. Is that a construct that anyone has considered, and what are the possibilities there?
Canada's already got a company called Octane who are doing just that. So not quite a mobile unit. Basically, what it is the concept is that if you have to take cells from the patient, ship them to a central facility, process them in the central facility, ship them back to the hospital. There's loads of handshaking there, loads of chances of making mistakes, errors, the cost is huge. We've just seen this with Provenge. It's principally why Provenge failed, is because the logistic chain was such a nightmare, and they do it 3 times. So I think now what's happening is people are now realizing that you could do point of care bioprocessing in a box. So what groups, research groups around the world, including my own and others, and there's a company actually in Canada already doing this. So cells are taken from the patient, injected into the box, and there's a series of basically like computer cards in there that it goes from one step to another, maybe a purification step to pull out the cells you want, an expansion step, a concentration step, and it's loaded out the other end into a syringe. And so I think for autologous, there is no choice but to go to these point of care boxes. And the reason for that is there just isn't the margin for a contract manufacturer and for a cell therapy company to make money on it. But if you had a point of care box, which is a razor blade model, as a basic box would sit there in the hospital somewhere, the patient cells go into a clip-in disposable unit, which then runs in the box, the cells are collected, that unit's then thrown away, next unit's put in for the next patient. I think that is the model we will see for autologous. I think it's the only model for autologous.
And this is why we need to collaborate. These solutions are all over the world, and it's so complex. And there's so many pitfalls along the way here. I mean, if you think about a startup company, it has investors, it's driven to get regulatory approval. In some jurisdictions, your quality systems have to be in place and manufacturing before the regulatory approval, some after. So there's tension, so you do a clinical trial somewhere just to get regulatory approval, but your manufacturing can't be changed, so the cost is not good. So deciding on what your market is, what your business model is, and the strategy to get there. If your market is the US, you have to do the clinical trials wherever in the world to meet the requirements of the US system. It may be jurisdictions where it can happen faster, or where there's leverage or infrastructure to do it faster, or a policy like Japan to get it done. All that's part of the plan, but the end game and the business strategy has to be really mapped out up front. And then you plan along the way. There's too much reactivity in the system right now, and a lot of decision making that is not based on that strategy. And it makes a lot of sense because you have a little bit of money, you got to move it forward. A little bit of money, you move it forward.
So is that something that CCRM can help?
That's the basis of creating these support organizations that are not just, it's not just CCRM, it's CCRM with 40 companies, companies like Octane or other tools companies or cell therapy companies. It's about multiple institutions, and in fact with CCRM it's multiple countries. And everybody is going to have to kind of inform these strategies to make them happen.
Excellent. Yes?
I do like to make that a comment regarding the strategy. And I know that we have a limited resource, but there is a lot of challenges. So in order, I would like to make a plea for the sponsors and the investigators that if you are thinking of conducting a study or to develop this product in US, please, at the early stage, contact us. Like FDA, we have from product discipline. One of my colleagues is here, as a matter of fact, and So at the early stage, you are concerned about the product issues, what your requirements. You come request the meeting. We have a pre-IND meeting. Even we have a pre-IND meeting. So we
no,
work
I've taken
on
advantage of
that.
that.
I think that's an important.
Very important.
Yeah, the same way that I always struggle with, people thinking commercialization is a bad word. It's necessary to get to patients. The same way regulatory authorities are actually allies in the process and need to be engaged early on. And from our, the partners we work with and our clients, most cases engaging the regulatory authorities early on pays huge dividends.
Huge, yeah, earlier the better. I mean, I think the beauty of the FDA is that you do actually have regulators who actually, in some instances, have their own laboratory growing stem cells and other things. And so they really have a feel for what we're struggling with. And I think that's something that the FDA is absolutely unique on, and I think that makes a very, very good pre-IND meeting.
Were there some other questions? Yes. Gentlemen, sir.
Okay.
May I go back to the Japanese system? So on the one hand, I like the system very much because it accelerates the process, and also I like the dialogue with the regulators, which I think is essential. But the other side is, how are they going to provide solid evidence after those 7 years? Because essentially what they do is a post-marketing phase 2 study, and the pre-marketing phase 2 study is not sufficient. So how are you going to provide solid evidence in the absence of a control group? And combining the data from, for instance, Europe or the US, I don't think that will work, because the Japanese population is a closed genetic population. It has a different background. You cannot simply transfer data from Europe or the US to Japan. So how do the regulators in Japan see that? How are they going to provide solid evidence in the absence of a control group for the efficacy and the long-term safety of the drug?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's a discussion which we've had with them. So first of all, the way the Japanese system works is the laws get passed and then the small print gets worked out. And so the small print should have come out a couple of days ago at the end of November. We haven't actually had a chance to actually read it and look at it. It's got to be translated first, so I can't tell you exactly what's in there. But what I can tell you is a little bit about the thinking. They are very interested in the idea of data coming in from elsewhere, from controlled clinical studies. Because the problem is, if you have a therapy for an unmet medical need, which is what the vast majority of these are going to be, that's been shown safe and has reasonable presumption that it's got efficacy, why would a patient possibly want to go on a double-blind clinical controlled trial and be in the control group? It just doesn't make sense. So they know there is an issue with this, and so they're very much welcoming working with the rest of the world. Now, what the rules are going to be in the end, I don't know, but the challenge is, if it's available and you're a patient and you pay 30% of the cost yourself, because 70% is from the government insurance scheme, you're going to want to go down the conditional approval. You're not going to want to be in a clinical controlled trial. And so that is a problem, and you identify it very correctly. But they are very warm to discussing with companies about looking at doing clinical trials elsewhere.
One additional issue to answer the question is, this will be mostly terminally ill patients.
No, not necessarily.
Not necessarily, but if you consider it for treatment of patients which failed every other treatment, so the big numbers that you will get, big data, will give you answers better, even better than controlled clinical trial, I think.
Yeah, you could certainly look at historical data, but the Japanese are certainly not looking at end stage. I mean, they are looking at cell therapy in general. It's not down to just end stage.
Well, it might be very relevant to developing anti-cancer treatments.
It may be relevant to, I think, all treatments. I mean, the problem is, and Michael and I were chatting about this last night, we need regulation that is bespoke for cell therapy and not regulation that's actually way out of the time of small molecules. And we've moved a long way. I mean, now, for example, small molecule drug is still done, healthy volunteers in the phase 1. Would we do that with a cell therapy? Of course we wouldn't, because the cells could hang around for the patient's life. And so we now do these phase 1/2s, which are really quite innovative. We do a small dose into a patient of cells below the therapeutic level, and if it's safe, we're then allowed to escalate the dose maybe 2 or 3 times during the course of the study with the potential to show efficacy. I mean, they are sort of innovative step changes that we need in this field to move forward quicker, and that's exactly how we do it.
So get on that. We need those changes in regulation. We're just about, do you have something quick? We're just about out of time. Well, that's a nice liaison. I want to, first of all, we'll stop here. We have time, so feel free to come forward and ask the distinguished panelists your individual questions. They can really give you great insights, as you've already seen the last hour. But I'd like to give them a round of applause.
Well done, Mike.
And